Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We begin now with Story 1. The Rise of the Weavers Guild in 12th Century Flanders. In the early 12th century, the region of Flanders, modern-day Belgium, and parts of northern France was a humming patchwork of towns nestled between rolling farmlands and critical trade routes. Among its towns, Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres stood out as bustling centers of textile production. But beneath the cloth-draped prosperity lay a story not of opulent trade fairs or noble commissions, but of ordinary weavers and their quiet fight for economic control. The roots of the Weavers' Guild in Flanders reach back to a time when textile production was largely a domestic affair. Wool was carded, spun, and woven in households, and its trade regulated loosely, if at all. But as the volume of trade grew, and as towns became more organized, it became clear that chaos threatened profit. Prices fluctuated wildly, fraud ran rampant, and disputes over quality became daily matters. Into this growing disorder stepped the first attempts at collective regulation. The need for order. You can imagine the town square of Ypres in the early 1100s. Narrow streets, the heavy scent of raw wool and urine-soaked dye vats. A master weaver's home doubled as a workshop, his apprentices hunched over looms as dogs barked and bells rang. Traders from England and Italy passed through, demanding quality goods but finding inconsistent standards. Something had to change. It was in this environment that the earliest forms of guilds emerged, not as powerful institutions, but as mutual aid groups. A group of weavers might agree to set prices or resolve disputes among themselves, but there was no formal charter, no oversight from town authorities. It was self-preservation at first. Yet, as more weavers gathered in towns and economic pressures mounted, these informal gatherings crystallized into recognized entities. Charters were requested and sometimes granted. By the mid-12th century, the Gilde was not merely a word meaning association. It became an institution with teeth. The Charter of Bruges, c. 1130. One of the first signs of institutionalization came in Bruges. In or around the year 1130, a document was issued, later referred to in city annals as the Charter of the Weavers, which formally recognized the right of the weavers to organize, regulate prices, and most crucially, inspect the quality of cloth produced in the town. The charter itself is dry, filled with procedural language. It specifies the measurement units to be used, the ell, a local unit of length, the weight of acceptable wool, and the fines to be paid for short measuring or using adulterated dyes. It required that finished cloth be inspected by elected wardens before it could be sold at market. But it was revolutionary, not in its scope, but in its recognition of the weaver's authority. The guild was no longer just a private pact, it had teeth granted by civic power. This gave birth to a small but powerful bureaucracy. Wardens, clerks, a common chest for fines, and inevitably disputes over leadership. The guild had to collect dues, record apprenticeships, and manage its own internal justice. Slowly, a weaver's loyalty became divided not just to his craft, but to this new body that claimed to protect it. Hierarchy and membership. Guild membership was not automatic. It required sponsorship, usually from an existing member, and proof of training, often a 7-year apprenticeship. Entry fees were charged, sometimes substantial enough to require a small loan. And once in, rules governed nearly every aspect of production. There were regulations on loom placement, hours of work, and even acceptable colors. For example, in some towns, a weaver was not allowed to use purple or crimson unless explicitly permitted. These colors were considered luxury goods, and their misuse was seen as deceptive. This control extended to family. Sons of guild members had preference, and in some cases, widows could continue running workshops for a limited time, provided they employed a journeyman. It was a web of regulation designed to ensure continuity, stability, and hierarchy. Resistance and tensions. But this control was not universally welcomed. Independent weavers, those working without guild membership or outside its regulations, became the first so-called black weavers. They sold cheaper cloth, often of lower quality, and disrupted the price floors set by the guild. They were also accused of avoiding taxes and inspections. The guilds responded with fines, public shamming, and in some cases force. There are records from Bruges town council of street brawls between guild members and independent weavers. In one case from 1148, 3 looms were destroyed in a night raid believed to be orchestrated by guild members seeking to enforce the law. Tensions simmered between the guilds and town councils as well. Civic leaders were caught between the desire for economic order and the pressure from merchants and townspeople for freer trade. If the guilds overreached, they risked being disbanded. If they failed to regulate, they risked irrelevance. A fragile balance. By the late 1100s, the Weavers' Guild in Flanders had grown into a robust, if brittle, institution. It set prices, trained apprentices, issued licenses, inspected cloth, and mediated disputes. It also faced internal tensions between older masters and ambitious journeymen, between towns with different regulations, and between the need for uniformity and the push for innovation. Still, this order allowed Flanders to become one of Europe's textile giants. English wool flowed through its ports. Italian merchants bought in bulk, and behind it all were the rule books of the guilds, the silent arbiters of thread, dye, and time. But what happens when economic growth outpaces the rules meant to govern it? What happens when the very institutions created to bring order become obstacles to change? The rise of the weavers, guilds in 12th century Flanders, was not an isolated development. It was part of a broader transformation across medieval Europe, a shift from informal trade to regulated economies, from loose networks of artisans to structured civic powers. Yet, in the second stage of the guild's rise, the weavers found themselves walking a precarious tightrope, balancing craft control with economic ambition, all while being watched carefully by town councils and merchant elites. This section traces how the weavers' guilds moved from local associations into powerful urban institutions. It reveals how their rise intersected with broader political dynamics, created new hierarchies, and inadvertently began to sow the seeds of their future limits. Urban expansion and the economics of scale. By the early 13th century, Flemish towns like Ghent and Ypres had undergone explosive growth. Populations swelled, trade increased, and with that came an increased demand for uniformity in textile production. English raw wool poured into the region, destined for looms that would convert it into finely woven cloth for export to France, the German states, and even beyond the Alps. Guilds found themselves no longer policing a handful of workshops. They were attempting to regulate entire neighborhoods. This required infrastructure. The weavers' guilds of Bruges and Ypres began establishing hall systems. These were large, central buildings, often stone-built and strategically located, where cloth could be weighed, measured, inspected, and taxed. They became hubs of economic life. A weaver could not sell outside these halls without incurring fines or risk. The halls also served as record offices, meeting spaces, and even religious centers. The guilds often maintained chapels and held patron saint feasts, usually honoring saints like St. Maurice or St. Veronica, associated with the textile trades. From a loose coalition of craftsmen, The guild had become a city within the city. Regulation of labor. But the increasing scale also brought greater internal stratification. By this time, 3 distinct ranks had emerged within the weavers' guilds. Masters, those who owned looms and workshops, had completed their training and paid their full dues. They were the voting members, the ones eligible for guild office. Journeymen, skilled workers who had completed apprenticeships but did not own their own shops. Many labored for years under a master, hoping to one day become one themselves. Apprentices, typically young boys, sometimes as young as 12, bound by contracts that could last 5 to 10 years. Their labor was cheap, and they were often housed and fed by their masters. The guild strictly enforced these divisions. Masters were required to register apprentices, and journeymen were often required to travel, known as the wanderjar in later Germanic guilds, before seeking full admission. These rules created both stability and frustration. For some, the system provided a clear, if slow, path to professional respectability. For others, especially journeymen, it felt like a trap. Records from the town of Ghent in 1197 show disputes in which journeymen petitioned the town council to overrule guild elders, arguing that certain masters had refused to promote skilled journeymen out of self-interest. While councils occasionally intervened, they were often reluctant to disrupt the autonomy of the guilds. The Weavers' Guild, originally designed to protect craft quality, had begun to function as a gatekeeper to economic mobility. Guilds and civic politics. The success of the weavers did not go unnoticed by city leaders. In fact, their growing wealth and organizational power made them both valuable allies and dangerous rivals to municipal authority. Many guilds began to accumulate land and invest in charitable institutions. The Guild of Bruges, by 1205, managed almshouses for widows of members and contributed to the upkeep of the town's defensive walls. They loaned money to the city during times of crisis. This economic power translated into political influence. By the mid-13th century, weavers were not only participating in civic ceremonies, they were sitting on town councils. Their elected elders negotiated taxation rates, access to raw wool, and even intervened in foreign trade deals. Some cities allowed guilds to appoint representatives to burgher assemblies, effectively giving craftsmen a voice in urban legislation. But this blending of power came at a cost. As guilds grew closer to civic governments, they became entangled in larger political struggles. Conflict with the merchants. The 13th century also saw the growing influence of merchant guilds, groups of traders and financiers, who operated on an entirely different economic logic than the weavers. Merchants favored scale, profit, and flexibility. They wanted fewer restrictions, faster production, and cheaper goods. In contrast, the weavers' guilds prioritized quality, tradition, and control. Inevitably, the two came into conflict. One of the most illustrative examples comes from Ypres around 1250. Merchants had begun importing pre-spun wool from England, bypassing the local carding and spinning process. This cut costs and increased volume, but the weavers' guild argued that the imported wool was of inferior grade and that using it harmed the reputation of Flemish cloth abroad. A battle of ordinances ensued. The city council, pressured by both sides, issued a compromise decree. Imported wool could be used only for certain grades of cloth and only with guild approval. The regulation required additional layers of inspection and effectively slowed production, precisely the opposite of what merchants wanted. Thus began a century-long pattern of negotiation, circumvention, and retaliation between guilds and commercial interests. Gender and the guild. Throughout this expansion, the role of women in the guild system remained ambiguous. Officially, women were excluded from full membership in the weavers' guilds. However, archival evidence from Ghent and Bruges suggests that women played a significant role in the production chain, especially in spinning, dyeing, and even loom work under male supervision. Widows of master weavers were sometimes granted temporary licenses to continue the business, particularly if they employed a male journeyman or had sons in training. A municipal register from Bruges in 1179 lists 14 women operating looms under such exceptions. Yet their contributions were systematically underdocumented. When regulations were tightened in the early 13th century, women's labor was pushed further into the shadows, still essential, but rarely recognized. It would not be until the more egalitarian structures of the silk guilds in Italy or the tapestry workshops of France that women would begin to gain institutional footholds. The limits of power. Despite their success, by the late 13th century, the weavers' guilds were beginning to show signs of strain. Their rigid regulations often made it difficult to innovate. New loom technologies such as horizontal treadle looms faced resistance from guild elders, who feared that increased productivity would flood the market and undermine prices. Apprenticeship numbers declined slightly in some towns, as younger workers balked at the length and cost of training, and journeymen began to organize informal brotherhoods of their own precursors to later labor associations demanding fair wages and challenging the dominance of master weavers. Tensions also emerged between guilds across different towns. The Bruges weavers demanded higher quality standards than those in Ypres, leading to accusations of cloth dumping and retaliatory taxes. The very system built to protect economic order was now becoming a source of economic friction. A loom with too many threads. By the end of the 13th century, the weavers' guilds of Flanders had reached their height: wealth, influence, and prestige. Their halls stood as monuments to craft regulation. Their statutes filled volumes. Their leaders mingled with civic officials. Yet within this very success lay fragility. The systems they built depended on balance, between craft and commerce, between control and innovation, between independence and regulation. But what happens when external forces, plague, war, or trade realignment shake that balance? What happens when the rigid structure of a guild meets the chaos of a changing world? By the early 14th century, the weavers' guilds of Flanders stood at a historical crossroads. Their ascent from informal alliances of textile workers to powerful urban institutions had reshaped the economies of Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres. These guilds had brought regulation, quality control, and professional identity to a sprawling craft sector. The same features that ensured their stability, rigidity, exclusivity, and centralized control would leave them vulnerable. When external shocks arrived in the form of demographic catastrophe, social revolt, and geopolitical realignment, the guilds found themselves increasingly unable to adapt. This is the story of how the weavers' guilds reached their zenith, encountered the limits of their own design, and set the stage for new forms of labor and resistance. The plague and its economic whiplash. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in Flanders. It swept across towns, leaving Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres with decimated populations. Estimates suggest that some urban centers lost as much as 40–60% of their residents. The loss of life was indiscriminate: masters, journeymen, apprentices, consumers. But while the plague was a demographic disaster, its economic aftershocks were more complex. With fewer workers, labor suddenly became a scarce commodity. Surviving weavers found themselves in a position to demand better wages. Many apprentices, freed from long contractual obligations by the death of their masters, simply left. Some migrated to nearby towns where regulations were looser or where guild structures had collapsed altogether. Guilds attempted to respond. In Ghent, the elders imposed strict limits on wage increases and forbade apprentices from leaving their contracts early. These measures were difficult to enforce. Town councils, more focused on rebuilding local economies, began to ignore guild ordinances when they conflicted with broader recovery goals. In effect, the plague undermined the guild's control of labor. Informal networks began to replace formal regulation, and new power centers emerged. The Ghent Revolt, 1379–1385. Perhaps the most dramatic reckoning with guild power came in the form of rebellion not against the guilds, but led by them. Between 1379 and 1385, Ghent erupted into one of the largest popular revolts of the medieval Low Countries. At its heart were economic pressures, grain shortages, rising taxes, and the perceived corruption of ruling elites. But crucially, the Weavers' Guild played a leading role in the uprising. By this time, the guild had become deeply embedded in city politics. Its leaders saw themselves not just as craft regulators, but as stewards of urban justice. When Count Louis II of Flanders imposed heavy taxes to fund wars with France, guild members joined with other artisans and townspeople to resist. The rebellion, led in part by a guild leader named Philip van Artevelde, captured the imagination of the working class. Under his command, Ghent's forces even defeated the Count's army at the Battle of Beverhoutsveld in 1382. For a brief time, the guilds controlled the city. Ordinances were passed expanding access to trade and limiting the power of merchant elites. Apprenticeship restrictions were relaxed. Cloth quality standards were still maintained, but entry into the profession was liberalized. But the triumph was short-lived. In 1385, after a long siege, the Count retook the city. The aftermath was brutal. Guild leaders were executed, ordinances repealed, and the guild's autonomy severely curtailed. The revolt had revealed a critical truth. Guilds were not just craft associations, they were political entities, and that made them targets. International trade and the English wool crisis. Meanwhile, another storm had been brewing beyond Flanders, the realignment of wool trade routes. Flemish weavers had long depended on English wool. It was considered the finest in Europe, especially the long-stapled varieties from the Cotswolds. For decades, English merchants sent raw wool across the Channel, which Flemish weavers then spun, dyed, and finished into cloth. But in the late 14th century, England began to shift its trade policies. In an effort to increase domestic revenues and strengthen its own cloth production, England began to restrict wool exports and develop internal textile industries. The so-called wool staple in Calais, an English possession after 1347, became the only legal export point, and tariffs were raised significantly. This created economic pressure on Flemish weavers. Cloth prices rose, access to raw materials became unstable, and cheaper, domestically produced English cloth began to compete in European markets. Guilds attempted to respond by tightening quality controls, lobbying for better trade terms, and even experimenting with alternative sources of wool from Spain, the Rhineland, and Scotland. But the damage was done. By the early 1400s, the textile supremacy of Flemish towns had begun to erode. Cultural decline and bureaucratic ossification. Internally, the guilds faced another problem, themselves. The very rules that had once elevated the profession, lengthy apprenticeships, rigid price controls, exclusive membership, had become barriers to innovation. New technologies, such as the more efficient horizontal loom and later the fulling mill, were met with suspicion or outright bans. Innovation came not from guild halls but from the margins, unregulated workshops, rural producers, or foreign competitors with fewer restrictions. The guilds doubled down on enforcement, creating ever more complex statutes and inspection procedures. By the mid-15th century, the weavers' guilds had become deeply conservative institutions. Their elaborate rituals, once sources of communal pride, became burdensome. Their bureaucracies swelled, and younger craftsmen increasingly sought opportunity outside the guild structure. What had once been an engine of economic progress had calcified into a protector of tradition. Lessons in regulation and resilience. And yet, even as their power declined, the legacy of the weavers' guilds endured. They had pioneered systems of labor regulation, quality assurance, and economic self-governance. They had provided social safety nets long before the modern welfare state: pensions, widow support, healthcare through guild hospitals. Their archives, often dry and repetitive, reveal something profound: the daily, disciplined work of economic order, not in grand gestures but in rules about thread count, dye temperature, and the exact width of a bolt of cloth. In Bruges, some of the old guild halls still stand. Their stones are worn, their interiors quiet, but they once rang with the voices of weavers arguing over wool shipments, journeymen bargaining for a place to sleep, elders deciding the future of their craft. The story of the Weavers' Guild is not a tale of tragedy or triumph. It is a history of structure: how humans, faced with the chaos of trade and the precarity of labor, built systems to endure. Systems that worked for a time. But what happens when systems built for survival become too rigid to evolve? What does the rise and quiet decline of the Weavers' Guild teach us about the institutions we rely on today? Story 2. Tanners and the Battle over Water Rights in York. In the 13th century, the northern English city of York was a thriving urban center, nestled within the protective shadow of its medieval walls and the strategic confluence of two rivers, the Ouse and the Foss. Markets bustled with trade in wool, grain, salted fish, and iron tools. But beneath the chatter of merchants and the clang of church bells, there was a different kind of noise: arguments and murmurs from a group of artisans whose work clung to the edges of the city, both geographically and socially. These were the tanners, men who worked with hides and skins, turning animal flesh into leather through one of the foulest and most vital processes in the medieval world. And at the heart of their work, both practically and politically, was water. The dirty work of leather. Tanning hides was never a glamorous occupation. To turn a raw animal skin into usable leather required soaking, liming, dehairing, fermenting, and drying, each step involving foul-smelling substances and large quantities of water. Tanners relied on nearby rivers and streams not only for the washing and rinsing of hides, but also as a way to dispose of the considerable waste their trade produced. Urine, dung, fish oil, lime, and decomposing flesh, these were not just smells that clung to the tanneries. They were realities that entered the city's waterways. Even in an age with different ideas of cleanliness, the scent and sight of tannery runoff were often too much for neighbors to bear. Tanners were usually relegated to the margins of medieval cities, literally. In York, they worked downstream, on the outskirts of the city's more refined neighborhoods, close to where the Foss and Ouse converged. Their yards were enclosed but open to the sky, filled with vats of tanning liquid and suspended hides. Despite the harsh conditions, the tanners were essential. Leather was used for shoes, belts, bookbindings, armor, water flasks, saddles, and even window coverings in poorer homes. No serious trade, no civic army, no monastery functioned without them. But their reliance on water and their effect on it soon brought them into conflict with others who claimed the same right to the rivers. A city divided by water. York's rivers served many functions. They provided drinking water, irrigation for nearby gardens, a place for washing clothes, and transport for goods. Millers used them to power water wheels. Brewers and butchers relied on them for rinsing ingredients and tools. And of course, tanners used them extensively for their work. This overlapping dependence made rivers politically charged spaces. Control over water wasn't just about access, it was about priority. Tanners usually worked downstream of the main city water sources. but runoff from their yards still found its way back into the broader waterways, often polluting the same rivers others relied upon for more delicate uses. By the mid-13th century, complaints began to surface in the city rolls. Millers claimed that the tanning waste clogged their channels and damaged their wheels. Brewers argued that foul-smelling water ruined their ale. Townspeople complained that riverside walks were impassable due to the stench. But the tanners did not go quietly. They responded with their own claims, that they had long-standing customary rights to use the rivers for their trade, that their yards predated the mills and breweries in question, and that the city itself had profited from the taxes and tolls levied on their hides for decades. The Guild's legal foundations. It's important to understand that the tanners of York were not unorganized laborers. Like other trades of the period, they began to coalesce into a recognized guild by the mid-1200s. The first references to the Guild of Barkers, so named for the oak bark used in the tanning process, appear in civic documents from around 1255. The Guild provided structure. It issued licenses, set standards for leather quality, and regulated apprenticeship terms. It also collected dues, helped sick members, and represented the trade in disputes with the city or other guilds. But unlike the wealthier merchant guilds, or even the bakers and butchers who sold directly to the public, the tanners' reputation made it difficult for them to ascend politically. The very nature of their trade marked them as unclean. In some city processions, they were made to march last. Their feast days were poorly attended by civic leaders, and their attempts to assert control over water access were met with thinly veiled contempt by more established trades. Despite this, the tanners had allies. The shoemakers, saddlers, and leatherworkers who relied on tan hides supported their claims. A 1262 petition to the York Town Council, signed by over 30 local craftsmen, demanded protection for the tanners' river rights, arguing that, without the barkers, the city's souls and swords go bare. Still, the tension grew. The conflict crystallizes. One of the earliest recorded legal confrontations came in 1271, when a group of tanners was fined for diverting part of the river Foss to create an artificial pool near their yards. The miller of St. Leonard's Mill claimed that this reduced water flow to his wheel, resulting in a failed harvest and financial loss. The court records show a striking level of detail: the depth of the diverted channel, the number of hides processed, the loss in grain output. The tanners argued that the channel was no different than previous ones dug decades earlier. The miller countered with new civic maps and statements from neighboring property holders. Ultimately, the court sided with the miller. The tanners were fined and ordered to fill in the diversion, but the case marked a turning point. From this point forward, every act of river alteration required city approval, and such approvals were rarely granted to the tanners. In practice, this meant that the tanners had to operate in tighter, more regulated quarters. They needed licenses for effluent disposal. They were forbidden from rinsing hides upstream of certain mills, and over time, these restrictions slowed production and raised costs. Tanning and the limits of respectability. Still, the tanners endured. They adapted by using deeper pits, installing crude filters, and even paying river guards to monitor effluent flows and settle disputes before they reached court. Some wealthier guild members began investing in land outside the city walls, where regulation was laxer. A few even bought private wells and attempted to work without direct river access. But the social limits of the trade were harder to escape. Even successful tanners found themselves excluded from higher civic offices. Few held aldermanic positions. Fewer still were appointed as sheriffs or mayors. Their children married into other artisan families, but rarely into the upper merchant class. The stink of the trade lingered both literally and metaphorically. By the end of the 13th century, the battle for water rights in York had not been won, but managed. Tanners still worked, still soaked hides, still shaped the economic life of the city. But their autonomy had been clipped. Their trade was bound by ordinance and prejudice alike. They had helped build the very infrastructure of medieval York, its belts, its bindings, its barrels, and yet they remained just outside the city's inner circle of power. An unseen backbone. In the quiet corners of York today, remnants of the tanners' work can still be found. Narrow alleys called Barker Lane or Tanner's Row hint at their presence. Discolorations in ancient stones mark where tanning vats once stood. And in the archives, the records of their petitions, fines, and contracts tell a story of persistence. They remind us that history is not only shaped by monarchs and merchants, but also by those who stood waist-deep in rivers, handling hides with bare hands, and insisting on their right to foul the water because in doing so, they sustained a city. But what happens when technology, expansion, and competing needs begin to erode even those managed rights? What becomes of a trade when its necessity is no longer enough to guarantee its place? By the early 14th century, the tanners of York had fought to secure their place within the city's urban machinery. They were no longer isolated artisans but organized, collectively governed through the Barkers' Guild. Their use of water essential to their trade had been tolerated, then regulated, and finally contested in open legal battle. But as urban development increased and river usage became more competitive, the real battle was no longer over water itself. It was over who had the right to claim necessity. We'll delve into how the politics of water in York hardened into an economy of access. The tanners, once tolerated for their utility, found themselves increasingly marginalized not by their filth, but by the encroachment of other, wealthier interests. The struggle for water rights evolved from a practical concern into a test of civic status. New players on the river. During the 14th century, York underwent a significant expansion of its commercial infrastructure. With growing ties to London and coastal trade, the city's economy was diversifying. Cloth fullers, dyers, millers, and brewers whose trades also depended heavily on water were growing in number and influence. The fullers were particularly problematic for the tanners. Both used water to cleanse and prepare fibers or hides. Fullers, however, had civic prestige. Their trade was central to the cloth industry, which brought York valuable export income. Unlike tanning, which offended the senses, fulling was seen as industrial progress. This shift in perception allowed fullers to gain more favorable rulings in disputes. When runoff from tanners' yards flowed downstream and disrupted fulling troughs, the city council tended to side with the fullers even when the tanners argued that they had been there first. A 1304 court record illustrates this change. A group of fullers petitioned the council, claiming the tanners had flooded the troughs with unclean matter and rendered the cloth unfit for sale. The council ordered a restriction on tanning operations near the fulling zones during daylight hours. Tanners were furious, not just because of the ruling, but because it marked the first time their daily working hours had been curtailed by ordinance. What had once been tolerated as the necessary stench of leather was now being treated as an unacceptable nuisance. Regulation becomes exclusion. This was the beginning of a slow but deliberate administrative squeeze. City records from 1311 detail new licensing fees for water access. While not explicitly aimed at the tanners, these fees disproportionately affected them because of the sheer volume of water their trade required. Tanners now had to pay not only for guild membership, apprenticeships, and market stalls, but also for the right to draw and discharge water at designated sites. The Barkers' Guild protested, claiming that the fees were discriminatory and would drive small tanners out of business. They were right. Within a decade, records show a steep decline in the number of licensed tanneries operating within the city walls. Some tried to adapt. A few of the larger operations purchased land outside Micklegate Bar and attempted to pipe water in from tributary streams. Others attempted a workaround. Instead of building tanning pits near rivers, They created dry yards, where hides were treated with imported water via barrel delivery. This method was costly and inefficient, and only the wealthiest tanners could afford it. The rest left. Movement to the margins. The exodus of tanning operations from York's inner core was slow but noticeable. As riverfront land became more expensive and tightly controlled, many tanners moved their workshops beyond the city gates, particularly along the southern bank of the Ouse where older byways led to rural hamlets. Here, regulation was thinner, waste flowed more freely, and while customers still had to travel farther to inspect or purchase leather, many were willing to do so in exchange for lower prices. This decentralization created a new dilemma for the city. On one hand, it reduced conflict within the urban center. On the other, it reduced the city's control and revenue from one of its oldest industries. Taxes were harder to collect. Inspections became sporadic. Illegal tanning yards, those operating without a license or outside the guild, proliferated. The tanners, in effect, had become economic refugees in their own city. Internal struggles and generational shifts. Within the Barkers Guild itself, tensions deepened. The older generation of tanners, those who had built their careers when urban tanning was secure, were reluctant to abandon their city yards. They continued to appeal to the council for favorable rulings, citing their historical rights and civic contributions. But younger tanners saw the writing on the wall. Many chose to establish themselves immediately outside the walls, avoiding guild oversight altogether. Some bypassed the apprenticeship system and began training their own sons directly. This undercut the authority of the guild and diluted the standards it had fought to uphold. A letter preserved in the York City archives from 1329 illustrates this generational divide. It records a dispute between a master tanner and his journeyman, who had left the city to start his own operation without guild permission. The journeyman, Thomas LeBrown, claimed he had no choice, for the waters are no longer ours. Even tanners no longer believed that York's rivers were part of their heritage. Water as a symbol of status. What's particularly striking about the tanners' conflict is how access to water became symbolic. It was no longer just a matter of who needed water the most, it became a test of civic virtue, cleanliness, and worth. Fullers were seen as productive, tanners were seen as polluters, brewers were vital to public health, tanners expendable. And while the goods they produced remained essential, the people who made them were increasingly framed as problems to be managed. This shift reflects a larger trend in medieval urban governance, the increasing association of environmental control with moral order. Cleanliness became not just a physical goal, but a social one. Professions that disturbed this order regardless of their necessity were gradually pushed to the fringes. In the case of York, the rivers, once tools of trade, had become instruments of exclusion. Echoes of the future. As the 14th century drew to a close, the Barkers Guild still existed, but it had been transformed. It no longer held the influence it once had over water rights, and it had become more of a ceremonial body than a powerful regulator. And yet the guild survived, quietly adapting. It diversified. Some members began selling finished leather goods directly, competing with shoemakers and harness makers. Others partnered with monasteries, providing leather for bindings, liturgical items, and armor straps. A few even invested in tanning operations in other towns, building networks beyond York. But the old system, the one where water and leather were tied together, in the same public space, had been broken. A river once shared. The rivers of York still flow. The Ouse glides under its bridges. The Foss trickles beside quiet gardens, but the loud, smelly, vital work of the tanners has long since vanished from its banks. They remind us, in their absence, that economic systems don't just change with innovation, or demand they change with perception, regulation, and status. What happens then? to a community when its labor is deemed too offensive to tolerate despite being essential. What lessons do the tanners of York offer us about the ways in which modern cities treat the trades that sustain them? By the dawn of the 15th century, the tanners of York had moved from the heart of the city's production economy to its margins geographically, socially, and politically. Their struggle over water rights had not only exposed the practical limitations of shared urban resources, but also the deeper mechanics of civic respect, environmental control, and labor stratification in medieval life. We examine how the tanners adapted to their declining status, how regulation morphed into exclusion, and what long-term lessons their story reveals about resilience in the face of slow civic erasure. Environmental justice in a medieval city. We tend not to think of medieval towns as sites of environmental policy, and yet the regulation of tanning its odors, runoff, and noise was fundamentally about the management of shared space. More precisely, it was about determining whose use of space mattered most. The tanners had once been considered essential, even if unpleasant, but by the 1400s, urban planning in York reflected a growing preference for clean trades, those that didn't offend the senses or disrupt higher-value commerce. Tanning was pushed out of the walled city entirely. A 1403 ordinance stated, "No person shall cast or drain any waters fouled by hides or offal into the king's river, upon penalty of fine, save only beyond the bounds of the city." The implication was clear. Tanning could continue, but only elsewhere. What was once a bustling, if malodorous, riverside activity had now been exiled to the periphery. This shift mirrors patterns we still see today: undesirable labor being relocated out of sight, out of smell, and out of policy priority. The rise of peripheral economies. As tanning moved outside the city walls, it didn't vanish. In fact, some operations flourished. Freed from the tight inspection regime of the city, rural tanners had more freedom in how they ran their yards. Villages just outside York, places like Fulford, Clementhorpe, and Layerthorpe, became semi-formal centers for tanning. These communities thrived on a combination of factors: lower fees, fewer regulations, and the continued high demand for leather. Some urban-based tanners even invested in these outer operations while maintaining a legal residence in York, allowing them to retain guild membership while sidestepping its restrictions. These hybrid arrangements reveal an early form of industrial outsourcing, one not driven by efficiency alone, but by exclusion from civic privilege. Still, this rural shift came at a cost. It was harder to recruit apprentices, transportation of goods was more expensive, and legal protections were weaker. Theft of hides or tools was more common outside the city's jurisdiction, and guild influence over standards began to erode, resulting in accusations of inferior leather entering city markets. By 1425, York had implemented new labeling laws requiring all leather sold within the city to bear a stamp identifying its maker and tanning location. It was a not-so-subtle way of demarcating who was still in and who had been pushed out. Quiet adaptation and the unwritten rules. Despite these challenges, the Barkers' Guild adapted in subtle ways. Its records from the early 15th century are less about fines and river access, and more about internal matters: funerary arrangements, feast days, apprentice tracking, and dispute resolution among members. This pivot suggests the Guild had accepted its diminished role in civic politics, and instead focused on maintaining cohesion among its remaining members. There's a quiet dignity in these later records. One entry from 1437 notes a donation by a retiring master named John Rawcliffe, who funded a new altar cloth for the Guild's chapel, embroidered with the symbol of a hide. It was not just a gift, it was a reminder of the trade's once central role in the city's economic life. Others took a more practical approach. A number of guild members began branching into related trades: harness making, glove making, parchment production. These professions were less stigmatized and still leather-based, allowing tanners to maintain their identity while shedding the most regulated aspects of their past. It was not a revolution, but a reorientation, a form of economic survival without political confrontation. Leather and power, a broader view. The story of the York tanners is not unique to that city. Across medieval Europe, tanners, butchers, dyers, and other polluting trades were subjected to similar pressures. Their labor was foundational to everyday life, but their presence was inconvenient to the increasingly ordered visions of the urban elite. And yet these trades endured. They moved, they changed, they bent without breaking. This pattern complicates the idea of medieval cities as rigid, guild-dominated machines. In fact, they were dynamic ecosystems of negotiation, adaptation, and resistance, especially on the margins. If we look closely at the tanning yards outside York's walls, we don't just see discarded skins and stinking vats. We see a kind of resilience, an insistence on making space, however uncelebrated, for labor that mattered. Echoes into the modern world. Though tanning has long since disappeared from York's urban life, its legacy lingers. The medieval city struggles over water rights, zoning, pollution, and labor hierarchy all have modern parallels. Today, we talk of environmental justice, urban planning, and essential workers, but the underlying dynamics are strikingly similar. Who gets access to shared resources? Whose labor is considered respectable? What kinds of work are allowed to exist in public view, and what kinds must happen out of sight? The tanners of York never won their battle for civic prominence, but they endured, adapted, and in their own way resisted the forces that tried to erase them. Their story is not one of triumph nor tragedy. It is one of persistence under constraint. And perhaps the next time we step into a modern city, clean and orderly, we might remember that much of its history, its belts, bindings, books, and boots was built on the back of rivers that once reeked. Story 3. A day in the life of a baker's apprentice in Lubeck. In the early 14th century, the port city of Lubeck stood as the crown jewel of the Hanseatic League. Situated on the northern coast of what is now Germany, Lubeck was a hub of maritime trade, administrative order, and civic pride. Its salt warehouses were legendary, its merchants wealthy, and its streets, by medieval standards, unusually well planned. But for all the clamor of cargo and silver, another sound shaped the rhythm of the city: the hollow, heavy knock of a baker's peel on the oven floor just before dawn. This is not the story of Lubeck's merchant elite. It is the story of Johann, a nameless, undocumented, and ultimately forgotten apprentice baker. One of dozens in the city, he was bound by contract, routine, and heat not to ships or guild masters, but to dough. Apprenticeship, contract, and constraint. Johann's apprenticeship likely began at the age of 12 or 13, when his parents, a modest family from the neighboring countryside, sought opportunity in the city. The process was formal. A master baker would sign a contract of indenture, registered with the local bakers' guild, and sometimes notarized by civic officials. The terms were strict. In exchange for food, shelter, and training, Johann would work for 7 years unpaid. He could not marry, could not leave, and could not engage in outside labor without permission. His days and nights belonged entirely to the oven. The apprentice's duties extended far beyond baking. He cleaned the floor with straw brushes, collected firewood, hauled sacks of grain, and delivered loaves across the city. In return, he was promised not just a trade, but entry into the network of city life. The guild, if he proved worthy, would one day allow him to join its ranks as a journeyman. But for now, Johann was just a boy with calloused hands and flour in his eyelashes. The rhythm of the night. His day began when others were fast asleep. Bakers in Lübeck fired their ovens between midnight and 2:00 a.m., long before the bells of St. Mary's tolled for morning prayers. The oven, a low stone dome fueled by alderwood, had to be carefully preheated and raked clear of embers before use. Johann's master Herr Gog was a stern but precise man, respected for the crust on his rye loaves and his ability to produce consistent weights under guild standards. For him, Johann lit the fires, tested oven heat with flour, a too dark scorch meant it was too hot, and fetched water from the city's public cistern. Only then could the day's work begin. The dough and the law. In Lübeck, bread was more than food, it was regulated infrastructure. The city maintained detailed statutes concerning bread prices, weights, and ingredients. These rules were written not for the elite, but for the people. Bread was the primary sustenance for laborers, soldiers, apprentices, and clergy alike. Each loaf was inspected by guild-appointed weighmasters, who used city-approved scales. A short loaf could result in fines, public shame, or even flogging for repeat offenses. To avoid this, Johann learned to portion dough carefully, always aiming slightly above the legal weight to avoid punishment. The recipe was simple but unforgiving: rye flour, water, salt, and sourdough starter. Wheat bread existed, but was rare and expensive. Only the upper classes consumed white loaves, sometimes called priest's bread or merchant rolls. Still, rye had its virtues. Dense, long-lasting, and slightly sour, it filled the belly and survived long voyages. A good rye loaf could be eaten over several days, an essential feature for workers and sailors alike. Delivery and discipline. At dawn, Johann made his rounds. Wearing a heavy wool tunic smudged with ash, he loaded baskets with warm loaves and delivered them to assigned households: a merchant's house near the harbor, the abbey kitchen, and a cloth weaver's family just inside the south gate. He was not allowed to dawdle. Any delay and the master would hear of it. Apprentices were expected to be invisible yet efficient, polite to women, silent before elders, and never seen loitering. Mistakes were punished, sometimes physically. A burnt crust, a torn crust, a spilled basket each might result in lashes, loss of food, or the temporary cancellation of Sunday rest. The apprenticeship was not just vocational training, it was a system of moral formation, where obedience was as important as skill. And yet, there were moments of light. On certain feast days, Johann would be allowed to eat the heel of a merchant's loaf or taste the fresh butter delivered to the abbey kitchen. He might even overhear gossip rumors of foreign ships arriving with cinnamon, or whispers of a plague ship docked in Rostock. In such moments, the world opened briefly beyond oven walls. Guild authority and boundaries. The Bakers' Guild of Lübeck was a tightly structured institution. Entry was not guaranteed, even after apprenticeship. One had to serve additional years as a journeyman, travel to other cities, and eventually complete a masterpiece, a loaf inspected for crust, crumb, and conformity. The guild maintained control over how many bakers operated within the city, the price and size of bread loaves, the quality of grain and the sources from which it could be purchased. It also maintained charitable functions, donating bread to poorhouses and sponsoring religious masses for deceased members. Membership meant security, but also surveillance. For Johann, the guild was both a future promise and a present threat. Any misstep, any report of insolence might find its way to the guild elders. The streets were watched, other apprentices talked, reputation mattered. An ordinary life, meticulously regulated. To modern eyes, Johann's life might seem suffocating. Bound by contract, shackled by hours, and immersed in the repetitive toil of dough and fire. But to him and countless apprentices like him, this was simply the order of things. His fingers hardened to the temperature of oven stones. His ears tuned to the creak of cooling crusts. His stomach marked the passage of time by the rising of dough. In a city of traders and treaties, he helped make something tangible: daily bread. Still, his life, like his loaves, existed under tight control. But what happens when firewood grows scarce? When grain prices rise or sea trade falters? What happens when a city dependent on bread must choose between regulation and hunger? We trace the rigid rhythms of a Lübeck apprentice baker's daily life, rising in the dark, tending to sourdough, avoiding mistakes, and existing on the periphery of recognition. But as we move into the second part of Johann's story, we shift from his quiet, contained world to the wider forces pressing in. The volatility of grain supplies, the rising threat of social unrest, and the mounting pressure on bakers to serve not only their masters, but the entire civic structure of the city. Because in medieval Lübeck, bread wasn't just sustenance, it was politics made edible. Grain supply, the lifeline in the trap. In theory, Lübeck was well positioned to manage its grain supply. As a Hanseatic port city, it had access to extensive trade networks stretching across the Baltic and North Seas. Barges and cogs delivered sacks of rye and barley from Prussia, Livonia, and even the fertile riverbanks near Danzig. In practice, the system was fragile. A single storm could delay shipments for weeks. A regional poor harvest could drive prices up overnight. Political tensions between merchant families or embargoes by rival ports could turn abundance into scarcity. And when the grain faltered, bakers bore the blame. Johann began to notice subtle changes. The flour sacks arrived later. The grain was more coarsely ground. His master spent more time at the guild hall in tense discussion. And the scales, always checked, always calibrated, were under increased scrutiny from city officials. In such times, apprentices like Johann became silent participants in a balancing act between survival and the letter of the law. The assize of bread. In many medieval cities, including Lübeck, bread prices were set not by the baker, but by the municipality, according to an official table of weights and prices known as the assize of bread. This system, designed to protect the poor, worked like this. When grain prices were low, bakers were required to bake larger loaves for a fixed price. When grain prices were high, loaves could be smaller, but the price remained steady. Bakers had to absorb the difference. While this may seem fair to the consumer, for the baker it meant tight profit margins and no room for error. If a shipment was delayed, if the grain arrived spoiled, or if even a single weighing official found a discrepancy in loaf size, fines were levied. Johann's master Herr Gog had been fined twice in 1 month for light loaves, even though he insisted the flour was damp and weighed less after baking. The guild protested, but the city stood firm. The people must have bread, and the burden fell on the oven. The people and the bakers. Bread riots were rare, but they happened. Across Europe, Paris, London, Krakow, when bread grew scarce, the first stones were often thrown at bakers' doors. Lübeck was not immune. On a cold morning in the winter of 1321, Johann heard the muffled shouting of townsfolk in the marketplace. Rumors of spoiled flour and short loaves had circulated for weeks. That morning, a barrel of barley bread from a rival bakery was found infested with grain beetles. The people's frustration, already stoked by weeks of near-empty stalls, boiled over. They demanded public inspection. They accused bakers of mixing sawdust into dough. They claimed apprentices were eating better than the working poor. The city responded by dispatching bread inspectors, known as Brotwiger, to visit every bakery in the district. Johann watched as officials with ledgers and scales examined every batch. They scraped crusts, weighed slices, even smelled the dough. His master was cleared, but the fear lingered. The guild's response: loyalty or leverage. The bakers' guild had a complex relationship with Lübeck City Council. On one hand, it enforced civic laws, trained new craftsmen, and supplied bread to the hospitals, military barracks, and almshouses. On the other, it constantly negotiated for relief price adjustments, grain priority, and exemption from fines during famine years. In the face of shortage, the guild acted decisively. It limited baking hours to conserve firewood, standardized loaf size to minimize variations and disputes, refused to take on new apprentices during periods of scarcity. This meant that Johann's workload increased, fewer hands, longer hours, and no extra food. The tension in the bakehouse grew. Herr Godk rarely spoke. Journeymen grumbled but dared not strike. Johann burned his hand on a hot iron peel but was told to finish the shift. The promise of a future guild membership now seemed distant, even doubtful. Hunger and blame. During severe shortages, rumors ran wild. Bakers were said to be hoarding flour. Some claimed they sold loaves to sailors for silver while townspeople starved. Others whispered of secret ovens used at night to make unlawful bread. There is little evidence these things happened, but in a society where food scarcity meant existential fear, the baker became a symbol of withheld survival. And yet the apprentice barely fed, barely paid, barely noticed, still carried the baskets, still stoked the fires, still carried out the will of a master caught between civic duty and economic reality. Johann, like many others, became a figure of paradox, a provider of bread in a city that was hungry, a symbol of stability in a system that punished both overproduction and underweight. Resistance and quiet protest. While formal protest by apprentices was unthinkable, resistance took quieter forms. Apprentices intentionally delayed deliveries to certain households seen as hostile. Loaves were subtly overbaked so they'd lose more weight, avoiding fines for underweight bread. Scraps of leftover dough were saved and shaped into tiny secret rolls bread that never entered the ledgers, eaten in corners after long shifts. Johann likely participated in these small acts not out of rebellion, but out of preservation. Even masters participated in quiet protest. Some began issuing sealed notes to trusted customers, promising a future loaf when the crisis ended. Others baked charitable bread, a plain, unsalted version distributed at church steps to prevent unrest. And yet the city tightened its grip, preparing for what comes next. By the time the shortage lifted months later, the bakehouse had changed. One journeyman had left, unable to pay his guild dues. Herr Godk walked with a limp burned in an accident during an overnight baking session. Johann, now 15, had grown into his tasks but carried a new awareness. Bread was more than a skill, it was a social contract. To bake was to bind one's hands in the gears of civic survival, to produce under threat of punishment, to endure in silence. But what happens when that silence breaks? When the apprentice becomes the master? When the guild can no longer protect its own from a population that sees them as villains? Would Johann remain a cog in this system, or one day challenge the terms of it? The city of Lübeck, with its salt-stained piers and timbered storefronts, had built its prosperity on regulation as much as trade. Every stone in its walls, every barrel on its ships, and every loaf in its ovens existed under a finely tuned balance of control. For apprentices like Johann, bakers in training, invisible but essential, the city was both a place of opportunity and confinement. Now we complete Johann's story, not as a tale of revolution, but one of transformation through persistence. This section follows the final years of his apprenticeship, his transition to journeyman, and the heavy responsibility that came with learning to bake under constant scrutiny. More than a story of bread, this is a story of how systems of regulation shape not just cities, but people. Journeyman years, the wandering baker. In most cities of the Hasidic world, an apprentice did not immediately become a master after completing his training. Johann, like others, was expected to become a journeyman, a baker, who traveled from city to city offering his labor in exchange for lodging, meals, and practical experience. This tradition, known in German as the Wanderschaft, had practical and cultural value. It prevented local guilds from becoming too insular. It spread techniques and improved consistency across regions. It gave journeymen a taste of independence, though always within limits. Johann packed a small sack, a spare tunic, a stamped letter of apprenticeship, and his baker's knife. He traveled first to Wismar, another Hanseatic port, then to Lüneburg, where the bread was lighter and yeast-based loaves were growing in popularity. In each city, he learned something new: different oven shapes, sourdough handling, firewood conservation techniques, and even how to blend millet or barley into bread without violating local statutes. But more than techniques, he learned perspective. He saw how different cities enforced regulations differently, how some were lenient, others draconian. In Lübeck, a 5-ounce underweight loaf brought a fine. In Lüneburg, it meant public shamming. Everywhere, however, the baker was a servant to civic order. By the age of 20, Johann returned to Lübeck with calloused hands, sharper instincts, and a weary appreciation for the compromises that came with baking for a population that demanded perfection. The masterpiece and the gatekeeper test. To gain full admission to the Bakers' Guild, Johann had to submit a masterpiece, a term not used with artistic grandeur but literal purpose. It was a practical test. Bake a loaf to exact specifications, using approved flour, under the watchful eyes of the guild elders. The requirements were exacting: a rye loaf of standard city weight, a white roll for ceremonial use, a honey-spiced bread, a nod to Lübeck's growing taste for sweets brought by trade with Bruges and London. Each product was inspected for crust uniformity, internal moisture, texture, and weight. Johann passed, barely. One elder noted a slight unevenness in his crust, but the others approved his techniques. He was granted entry to the guild, but with it came dues, inspections, civic obligations, and responsibility. His journey from apprentice to journeyman to master had not made him freer. It had made him part of the machine. Bread as public duty. As a master baker, Johann inherited his late mentor's oven, a cramped but reliable space on Fischergrube near the fishmonger's stalls. He trained his own apprentices, enforced weights with a diligence born from being punished himself, and kept careful accounts. But he also inherited a city more anxious than before. The 1340s brought signs of trouble, murmurs of plague in the south, rising grain prices, erratic trade winds disrupting shipments. The council began issuing increasingly restrictive edicts. Bakers were forbidden from baking multiple types of loaves in a single batch, to reduce inspection confusion. Civic officers began raiding bakehouses unannounced, checking not just weights, but wood quality and ash disposal methods. Loaves for hospitals and poorhouses had to be prepared without salt to stretch resources further. Johann obeyed, but not without cost. His apprentices grew tired, his profits dwindled, and the memory of lean years came back not as memory but as reality. Still he baked. Crisis, the year of fire and pestilence. In 1350, Lübeck faced a year of combined disaster. A fire tore through part of the city's southern wall. That same spring, the Black Death arrived, likely by ship from Gdansk. Markets emptied, ships stopped arriving, flour grew scarce, the death toll mounted. Johann's bakehouse did not close, even when others did. He reduced his batches, took in the orphaned son of a fellow baker, and like many guild members distributed emergency bread baked with bran and acorn meal. The guild, to its credit, stepped in. It paid for grain to be imported from Denmark, built temporary ovens for mass production, suspended all membership dues until the crisis passed. The council made it law that no household would be denied bread, even if they could not pay. It was an extraordinary moment of civic unity, but also a reminder of how essential regulated trades could be in times of collapse. And Johann, once an invisible apprentice, now stood at the center of his city's resilience. Beyond the loaf, bread as legacy. When the crisis abated, Lübeck was changed. So was Johann. He resumed normal production, slowly hired more workers, and began documenting his methods not as a matter of pride but as a form of survival. He knew that the memory of famine would fade. Rules would change again. New tensions would arise. But bread would remain. He began keeping a ledger, not just of sales, but of public events, shortages, rainfall, and grain arrival dates. He annotated baking temperatures and moisture levels. This small act of record-keeping, mundane, uncelebrated, mirrored what hundreds of other bakers across Europe were beginning to do: preserve knowledge to protect the future. He trained his final apprentice, a girl named Anneliese, an unusual choice but not forbidden. She had been the daughter of a deceased shipwright and had shown quiet skill and enormous patience. The guild did not intervene. Perhaps the old rules, even in Lübeck, had started to loosen at the edges. Final reflections: the invisible builders of cities. Johann died sometime around 1373. His name, if recorded, was likely spelled incorrectly in a brittle parchment buried in the Lübeck city archive. His bakehouse was passed to another. His loaves turned to crumbs. But the imprint of his labor, and those like him, endures. Bread was never just food in medieval cities. It was infrastructure, currency, ritual, and trust. It tied civic order to household hunger, and it depended on thousands of nameless hands that kneaded, stoked, and weighed beneath the watchful eye of bureaucracy. In the story of Lübeck, we celebrate its salt trade, its Gothic churches, its towering merchant houses. But perhaps we should also remember the apprentice who lit the oven before dawn and never stopped baking through riots, famine, and plague. Because cities are not only built with stone and silver, they are built with loaves, baked to weight and carried in silence. Story 4. The struggle for independence, women's role in the silk guilds of Bologna. Bologna, in the 13th and 14th centuries, was a city of remarkable contradictions. It boasted Europe's oldest university, drew students from across the continent, and served as a legal and intellectual hub of northern Italy. It was a place of charters and codices, of parchment and parchment makers. But beneath the hum of legal discourse and papal diplomacy, Bologna was also a city of silk. Silk production was laborious, specialized, and vital to the city's economy. And unlike the male-dominated guilds of masonry, metalwork, and baking, the silk industry relied heavily, if often invisibly, on women's labor. We follow the story not of a famous guildmaster or wealthy merchant, but of the anonymous silk women of Bologna, mothers, widows, apprentices, and entrepreneurs, who worked both within and beyond the guild structure to earn a living and carve out a space in a system that both needed and restrained them. A loom in the home. Silk weaving in Bologna was unique in Europe. While cities like Lyon or Venice centralized their silk production in formal workshops, Bologna developed a domestic silk economy, a network of home-based looms operated by women and families who wove cloth under contracts from merchants or guild masters. These were drawlooms, a sophisticated type of handloom capable of producing complex patterns, operated by two people, typically a weaver and a drawb, or assistant. They allowed for the creation of intricate damasks and brocades that appealed to the elite. But many of these looms weren't in commercial studios. They were in kitchens, bedrooms, or enclosed courtyards. The weavers were often women, working from home while raising children, caring for sick relatives, or managing small holdings. City records refer to them vaguely as donne di seta, women of silk. But their labor was very real, very regulated, and rarely recognized with guild membership. Invisible workers in a structured world. Bologna's silk guild, the Art della Seta, was established by the mid-13th century. It governed who could produce silk, what types of thread could be used, and how cloth was to be measured and inspected. It controlled pricing, settled disputes, and maintained export relationships with Pisa, Venice, and the papal court in Avignon. The guild had detailed statutes, but women were not listed among the full members. They were acknowledged only as assistants, household contributors, or in rare cases, inheritors. When a master silk weaver died, his widow could apply to temporarily manage the workshop, but she had to agree to employ a male overseer and could not take on new apprentices. Still, the economic reality was clear. Silk production depended on women. In the home, women prepared the raw silk, reeled filaments, dyed threads using mordants and plant-based pigments, and wove cloth often with no recognition outside merchant ledgers. They trained daughters, nieces, and neighbors not formally, but skillfully. One 1287 contract records a silk merchant commissioning 6 ells of brocaded silk from a married couple, but the name of the woman who wove the pattern was left out. The husband signed. She is listed only as uxor wife. Apprenticeship and loopholes. Despite official restrictions, some women found paths into formal training. Guild statutes permitted girls to serve as assistants in silk workshops beginning at age 12. These girls weren't labeled apprentices, but their tasks mirrored those of male apprentices in other trades: cleaning tools, preparing dyes, learning warp and weft patterns, even drawing designs under supervision. While they could not take the master's exam, they could become contracted workers, receiving wages or, more often, piece rate payments, small sums per yard of silk produced. Widows had more legal leeway. Bologna's legal code, more progressive than some of its northern counterparts, allowed widows to inherit tools, contracts, and even business debts. Several cases survive of widows suing merchants for non-payment or demanding restitution for damaged thread. One notable example is the 1304 case of Beatrice della Teglia, who filed a petition with the city podesta, claiming a merchant shorted her on payment for dyed silk thread. The court ruled in her favor, a rare legal acknowledgement of a woman's independent labor within the silk economy. Yet Beatrice remained outside the guild. Women's cooperatives, the quiet alternative. Excluded from formal guild control, some women took matters into their own hands. By the early 14th century, there are mentions in city records of female cooperatives, informal networks of women who pooled tools, dyes, and labor. They rented small communal spaces or rotated use of a large drawloom owned by a widow or elder. These groups existed in a legal gray area. Some merchants welcomed them, as they offered lower prices and faster turnaround. Others condemned them as ungilded and accused them of producing inferior cloth. The Guild Council responded with attempts to regulate, requiring merchant contracts to specify guild-licensed workshops, imposing fines for purchasing silk from unauthorized sources, and even banning the sale of silk dyed outside approved quarters of the city. But the cooperatives persisted. They served as training grounds, support networks, and survival strategies, especially for women without husbands or male relatives to act on their behalf. They were not rebellious, they were resourceful. When regulation meets necessity. Over time, even the guild began to quietly adapt. By the 1330s, the Art della Seta began issuing temporary work permits to unmarried women or widows, especially during labor shortages or plagues. These permits did not confer full membership, but they allowed women to legally complete merchant commissions and receive payment directly. It was a compromise. The guild maintained control over prices and quality. Women gained a sliver of legal standing. In effect, Bologna's Silk Guild was softening its borders, without changing its statutes, acknowledging that economic survival required flexibility, even if that flexibility remained unspoken in the guild roles. But what happens when women begin to demand not just inclusion, but independence? What happens when a widow decides not just to complete a contract, but to claim the title of master? And how does a guild built on male hierarchy respond when women refuse to remain silent? By the mid-14th century, Bologna's silk industry was both flourishing and fraying. Silk was now the city's most valuable export, woven into intricate brocades, twisted into brilliant cords, and dyed in hues rivaling those of any northern court. The Art della Seta continued to regulate quality, issue contracts, and collect dues. But as the industry grew, so did the number of women working outside formal structures preparing, spinning, weaving, and dyeing silk, often without guild recognition or protection. In the cracks of this regulatory system, a quiet form of resistance took root. We follow the Donne di Seta, the women of silk, as they began to assert themselves not only through work, but through legal action, religious patronage, and community solidarity. It's a story of slow defiance, told in petitions, fines, and fabric. Breaking the pattern, the widow's rebellion. The most documented challenges to the Silk Guild's male authority came from widows, women who, by law, inherited their husbands, workshops, and trade tools, often along with debts and apprentices. These widows were not a minor force. In Bologna between 1340 and 1370, at least 42 court cases survive involving widows in the silk trade. Most were commercial disputes, non-payment for labor, delivery of defective thread, failure to meet contract terms. But they reveal something more profound: women demanding to be treated as economic actors in their own right. Take the case of Lucia di Viganza, a widow who had inherited her husband's silk dyeing workshop. In 1349, she completed an order of 5 bolts of dyed silk for a merchant named Matteo d'Albano. When he refused to pay the full sum, citing imperfections, Lucia took him to court not as a dependent of her husband, but under her own name and seal. In testimony, she presented dye records, thread samples, and statements from 2 other women who worked alongside her. The judge ruled partially in her favor and ordered Matteo to pay a reduced amount. It wasn't a revolutionary victory, but it was a legal acknowledgement of female craft authority, and one that came without guild membership. The guild strikes back. The Art della Seta viewed these developments with unease. While it tolerated temporary female management of workshops after a master's death, it did not want a class of independent women operating indefinitely. So the guild began tightening enforcement of its statutes, imposing time limits on widow-run shops, usually 1-2 years, requiring that all apprenticeships overseen by a woman be supervised by a male guardian or overseer, banning female-operated shops from employing more than 2 workers, regardless of demand. These limitations were not universally enforced. City politics, merchant pressure, and shifting labor needs often complicated matters, but they served to reinforce a clear message: women were exceptions, not equals. Still, many widows found ways to stretch or circumvent these rules. Some remarried strategically, choosing business-minded men willing to act as legal fronts, while the widow continued running the operation. Others entered into contracts as assistants, while producing entire bolts of fabric on their own looms. And some simply ignored the rules, operating in marginal neighborhoods and relying on loyal customers rather than guild endorsement. Religious cover and economic reality. Another strategy adopted by silk-working women was spiritual patronage. By funding chapels, altarpieces, or masses, female silk workers sought to position themselves as pious contributors to the moral economy of the city. This gave them social legitimacy, even if guild legitimacy remained elusive. One surviving example is the Confraternity of Saint Zita, named after the Tuscan patron saint of working women and domestic servants. Founded by and for women involved in textile work, silk, linen, and wool, the confraternity provided a spiritual community, economic aid, and a platform for modest public visibility. Members of the confraternity wore simple badges with Zita's likeness, gathered for prayers, and pooled resources to care for sick members. They also occasionally helped pay fines imposed on women by the guild for unauthorized production or market sales. This use of religious networks to resist economic marginalization reflects a broader pattern in medieval Europe, women engaging with the church not only for salvation, but for social leverage. Daughters of the Loom, informal education. While the guild barred girls from formal apprenticeships, women quietly trained daughters, nieces, and neighbors in the full range of silk production. Reeling, warping, weft design, tension control, and dye stability. Education was hands-on, repetitive, and largely undocumented, but it worked. In neighborhoods near Porta San Donato, tax records show clusters of homes listing spinners and thread winders as occupants. In at least 6 cases between 1355 and 1370, women under the age of 18 were listed as contributors to household income via silk labor. These girls, though unnamed in guild records, formed a silent labor base that sustained Bologna's silk economy. Without them, the city could not have met export demands or fulfilled religious orders for ceremonial garments. Yet none of them had a path to become a recognized master. Market day resistance. The weekly market in Bologna's Piazza Maggiore was more than a place to sell loaves and bolts of cloth. It was a site of tension between the regulated and unregulated economy. Guild inspectors monitored booths, checked weights, examined weave quality, and ensured that unauthorized producers weren't selling silk directly to the public. Yet many women, especially widows, risked fines to do just that. A 1368 report notes an elderly woman selling twisted silk thread of unknown origin near the church of San Petronio. She was fined 2 soldi and had her goods confiscated. But a week later, a similar report names another woman, this time with a basket of dyed silk ribbon, claiming it was excess from a merchant order. It's likely these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger, informal pattern. Women producing beyond what their authorized work allowed, and slipping the margins of guild enforcement for small but crucial economic gains. Weaving autonomy. Over time, some women began to frame their silk work as a form of independence, not just labor. Letters from the 1380s, rare, but preserved in merchant archives, show women negotiating direct commissions. These letters, often dictated and signed with a cross, reflect an evolving self-image. In one, a woman named Madonna di Biagio offers to fulfill a standing order of patterned brocade on behalf of my household, which lives by the loom. There's pride there and subtle defiance. These weren't rebels in the modern sense. They weren't calling for dismantling the guild system or forming political movements, but they were demanding space, legal, spiritual, and economic, to do the work they had always done, and to be named as its rightful practitioners. But could they ever be recognized within the guild, not just in spite of it? Would Bologna's Silk Guild ever open its doors not just in crisis, not just to widows, but to women as artisans in their own right? Or would women forever remain the invisible thread holding the industry together? As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, the women who worked the silk looms of Bologna, once faceless and nameless in the city's economic annals, had become a force that could no longer be overlooked. They had resisted quietly, weaving in kitchens and courtyards, managing shops through widowhood, selling thread on market fringes, and invoking saints and contracts in equal measure. But now, a slow shift was underway. Whether by necessity or evolution, the rigid boundaries of the art della seta began to loosen. This final section traces the subtle but meaningful transformation of the guild's relationship with its most unacknowledged labor force. It also offers a reflection on what this centuries-old conflict tells us about work, recognition, and the institutional gatekeeping that often follows prosperity. The plague opens the loopholes. The turning point, as it was in so many corners of medieval Europe, came not through politics but through pestilence. The Black Death struck Bologna in waves, first in 1348, then again in the 1360s and 1380s. With each outbreak, the city's labor pool shrank. Guild masters died, male apprentices disappeared, merchants faltered, and yet the demand for silk, particularly for ecclesiastical garments and burial shrouds, did not stop. Faced with a shortage of skilled male labor, the art della seta did something it had long resisted. It sanctioned women to act as full participants in silk production. Not out of generosity, but survival. Temporary guild permits became more common, and more importantly, longer lasting. Widows were allowed to retain apprenticeships for extended periods. Some unmarried women were granted official recognition not as masters, but as official workers with the right to produce silk under their own name for fixed terms. These acts were not wholesale reform. They were stopgaps, but in practice they created a precedent. Women now appeared in the guild's own roles, sometimes with notations like operaria licita, permitted worker. The guild door, once locked tight, now stood slightly ajar. The masterless workshops. Out of this new permissiveness emerged a curious phenomenon. Masterless workshops operated entirely by women. Records from the 1390s mention multiple small silk production houses in Bologna's Borgo San Pietro district that had no registered male master. Instead, they were staffed and operated by women, only mostly widows, daughters, and maidservants trained on the loom. Some of these workshops specialized in low-margin items like ribbons and cords. Others produced altar cloths or silk trim for liturgical use. One workshop, linked to a woman named Francesca de Righi, reportedly produced over 20 bolts of patterned silk per year, enough to supply several city churches. These workshops were tolerated as long as they paid guild taxes, adhered to quality inspections, and stayed out of political trouble. It was a compromise that satisfied no one entirely. The guild disliked the autonomy but needed the goods. The women were still excluded from full membership but had carved out a space of authority. Formal recognition, almost. In 1405, the Art della Seta debated a proposal to formally create a secondary register for women silk workers, essentially a parallel system that would offer recognition without full guild status. The arguments were heated. Some guild elders feared corruption of standards and loss of the guild's dignity. Others pointed out the economic necessity, citing shortages in skilled male weavers and growing merchant demand. A few even warned that refusing the proposal would push women into permanent informal production, outside the reach of taxation or regulation. Ultimately, the motion passed in part. A register of authorized female producers was created. It allowed women to take on up to 2 apprentices, submit goods for guild inspection, use official guild measurements and weights, be paid directly by merchants under contract. What it did not allow was access to guild leadership, voting rights, or participation in pricing decisions. It was, in essence, institutional tolerance without inclusion. Generations on the loom. By the 1420s, entire familial lines of women silk workers appear in the city's tax rolls. Mothers, daughters, sisters, all engaged in dyeing, weaving, and finishing silk goods. Some became prosperous enough to purchase homes, fund dowries, or even act as creditors, lending small sums to neighbors or other workshop owners. A few women left wills bequeathing looms, dye vats, and silk threads to female relatives, specifically stating they were not to be sold or absorbed into male-operated workshops. In one such will from 1427, Contessa di Bartolo, a woman in her 60s, left a fully equipped loom, along with 10 bolts of finished silk and 30 florins in cash, to her granddaughter. She added, "That she may work as I have, with the dignity of labor and the blessing of Saint Zita." It is a line as weighty as any charter. Limits and legacy. Despite these gains, women in Bologna's silk industry never gained full parity with their male counterparts within the guild. They remained in a separate category acknowledged, but always othered. Even the most skilled, prolific women could be displaced by a lesser qualified man with guild credentials. But their persistence had a lasting impact. By maintaining production during crisis, innovating in home-based methods, training new generations, and quietly demanding fairness in court and contract, these women forced the guild to adapt, even when it resisted. They created a tradition of female craftsmanship in Bologna that would influence later labor movements, textile collectives, and women's guilds in early modern Italy. And they did so not by storming guild halls, but by weaving, dyeing, and managing with such consistency and skill that their presence became undeniable. A final reflection: the fabric of exclusion. The story of Bologna's silk women is not one of open revolution. There were no riots or manifestos, no sudden proclamations of equality. Instead, it is a story of insistence, quiet, daily, relentless. They turned labor into leverage. They made marginal status into partial recognition. They converted craft into community. And through it all, they proved that institutional exclusion, no matter how complete it seems, is never impermeable when people work together for space, credit, and dignity. Their threads remain in the records, partial, faded, often nameless, but strong enough to pull back the curtain on a system that, for all its rules, could not fully keep them out. Story 5. The Cordwainers of Paris and the First Guild Charter Dispute. In medieval Paris, a city of swelling populations, vaulted cathedrals, and pulsing marketplaces, it was easy to overlook the humble shoemaker. Called cordwainers from Cordovan, the soft leather originating in Cordoba, Spain, these craftsmen produced some of the most essential items in the urban wardrobe. Shoes were not luxury in 13th century Paris. They were survival, protection from mud, disease, cold stones, and the detritus of a busy, unpaved metropolis. They were also one of the earliest products to be formally regulated by guild statutes. This is the story of the first documented guild charter dispute in Paris, one that involved cobblers, cordwainers, cut leather, class tension, and a king whose signature became the battleground over who could make shoes, and who could call themselves a master. The two guilds of the soul. Before we go further, it's important to understand the distinction between two overlapping trades. Cordwainers, cordoniers. These were the shoemakers who crafted new shoes from fine leather, often cordovan or calfskin. Their work was considered skilled, and their customers ranged from burghers to clerics and noble households. Cobblers, sabatiers. These artisans primarily repaired old shoes and occasionally made cheap footwear from patched or recycled leather. Their clientele was the lower-class laborers, apprentices, and servants. In practice, the two professions shared materials and tools, but guild statutes kept them fiercely divided. The cordwainers claimed that cobblers should not be allowed to make new shoes, lest their lower prices undercut quality and guild reputation. The cobblers, in turn, argued that their customers couldn't afford the cordwainers' goods, and that their ability to craft entire shoes was a right, not a privilege. And by the year 1268, this conflict exploded into the first formal guild dispute brought before the royal provost of Paris. The Charter of the Cordwainers. The cordwainers had secured their guild charter earlier than many trades in Paris, around 1260, under the reign of King Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis. The charter gave them exclusive rights to produce new shoes, authority to inspect leather brought into the city, power to regulate apprenticeships and prices, The guild's leadership, composed of elected jurés, sworn masters, was authorized to levy fines on violators and conduct surprise inspections of competitors' workshops. At first, the cordwainers flourished. Their shops, mostly located on the Rue de la Tannerie and Rue Saint-Denis, became known for the quality of their goods. Even minor nobles and university scholars began commissioning boots and slippers from the guild. But success bred friction. Cobblers working just a few blocks away were still making new shoes technically in violation of the cordwainers' charter, but often overlooked by local officials who favored practical availability over strict enforcement. The cordwainers began filing complaints. At first, these were informal petitions. Then came levied fines, then the confiscation of goods. And finally, in 1268, the cobblers struck back with a petition to the crown, claiming unlawful restriction of trade. A dispute of definitions. The core of the dispute rested on definitions. What exactly qualified as a new shoe? Was a shoe made from new soles, but recycled uppers considered new? Could a cobbler build a shoe if the customer brought their own leather? If a cordwainer repaired a shoe beyond recognition, was it still a repair? These were not idle semantic debates. They had legal and financial consequences. Cobblers who violated the charter risked heavy fines, loss of tools, and public censure. Cordwainers who failed to enforce their monopoly risked devaluation of their product and erosion of their guild authority. The dispute reached the desk of Etienne Boileau, the royal provost of Paris and the author of the famous Livre des Metiers, the Book of Trades, a record of Parisian guild statutes commissioned by Louis IX. Boileau summoned representatives from both sides to present their case. In the provost's chamber, the meeting took place in the Châtelet, the administrative center of royal justice in Paris. Present were 3 master cordwainers, led by Guillaume le Curé, a respected juré of the guild. 2 cobblers, including Jean Savat, a veteran craftsman known for his repair skills and pointed tongue. The cordwainers presented their charter and a list of violations. The cobblers countered with testimony from low-income residents who said they could no longer afford footwear if limited to guild-approved shops. Guillaume le Curé insisted, "To permit inferior shoes from unlicensed hands is to bring shame upon the city's name." Jean Savat replied, "Is it a shame for a man to walk with covered feet, even if the leather is less fine?" Boileau, pragmatic and loyal to the king's interest in public order, listened. After days of deliberation, he issued a decision. The decision of 1268. Boileau ruled in favor of limited tolerance. Cordwainers would retain exclusive rights to craft shoes from new premium leather. Cobblers would be permitted to make shoes from reused or lower-grade materials, provided they did not advertise their wares as new. Cobblers could not employ apprentices for shoemaking, only for repair work. Both trades would be monitored by jurés, with oversight rotating every year. The ruling was a compromise. It protected the cordwainers' prestige while acknowledging the cobblers' economic role. But it set a powerful precedent that a guild charter, even one approved by royal authority, was subject to modification when broader civic needs conflicted with monopolistic control. This was the first known case in which 2 guilds were forced into coexistence by the crown, and it would influence similar disputes in London, Florence, and Bruges in the following century. Shoes as symbols. In the aftermath, the cordwainers remained powerful, but the cobblers gained confidence. Their shops began to advertise workmen's shoes and servants' boots, carefully avoiding the term new, but clearly responding to market demand. Shoes became more than goods, they became social indicators. Guild-made shoes with detailed stitching marked status. Cobbled shoes with visible seams marked poverty, but also resourcefulness. Custom-made shoes became fashionable among the university elite. spreading trends faster than the guilds could control. By the 1270s, the streets of Paris told a quiet story with every footstep, not just where a person walked, but who was allowed to make the shoes they wore. But what happens when a guild's authority, once built on royal privilege and civic necessity, begins to erode under the pressure of practicality and growing population? When does a craft become a right, and who gets to decide? The ruling of 1268 had been a compromise and uneasy peace between Paris's cordwainers and cobblers. But peace in medieval urban economies was often temporary, especially when it meant accepting coexistence rather than enforcing dominance. As Paris expanded through the late 13th and into the early 14th century, so too did its appetite for footwear. A growing population, increasing migration from rural areas, and rising demand for inexpensive goods created new pressures. Beneath the smooth leather soles of the city's walking class, a new set of conflicts brewed, ones that would test the limits of guild power, economic necessity, and the increasingly visible divide between craft and commerce. Markets on the move. The growth of Paris in the late 13th century brought more than stone, and scaffolding it brought new marketplaces, including informal ones. Open-air stalls cropped up on the outskirts of regulated commercial zones, particularly along the right bank, near the Place de Grève, and just outside the walls of Les Halles. Here, cobblers increasingly sold shoes that defied the 1268 compromise. These weren't just repaired or repurposed goods, they were freshly crafted, albeit from lower quality hides, sometimes imported and sometimes salvaged. Many of these cobblers were not guild-affiliated at all. They were journeymen who never made it into guild ranks, rural migrants with shoemaking skills, or even women producing simple footwear within households and reselling them discreetly. The cordwainers took notice. Guild jurés began patrolling these market fringes, attempting to seize unlicensed shoes and report vendors to the provost's officers. But enforcement was haphazard. City officials, increasingly sympathetic to lower-class buyers and strained by the complexities of urban governance, were reluctant to act decisively. A petition from the cordwainers in 1282 lamented, "We uphold the king's law, yet are surrounded by shoemakers of shadow who defy both scale and seal." Their plea was ignored. Royal interest versus guild authority. In truth, the French crown had little incentive to enforce the cordwainers' monopoly too strictly. Paris depended on social stability. While the guild system offered structure and tax revenue, it could not outweigh the risk of unrest if basic goods like bread, candles, and shoes became unaffordable or scarce. Shoes made by cobblers were cheaper, and for the growing population of laborers, apprentices, porters, washerwomen, and students, guild-made shoes were prohibitively expensive. The crown began quietly issuing temporary waivers permits that allowed cobblers to sell in specific quarters during feast days, market festivals, or periods of poor weather. These waivers were rarely publicized, but they gave legal cover to the very activity the cordwainers condemned. By 1290, at least 6 quarters in Paris had semi-permanent cobbler markets operating with partial royal protection. The cordwainers, feeling their position slipping, doubled down. Internal strain, the price of prestige. Within the cordwainers' guild itself, trouble was brewing. As external competition grew, some wealthier master cordwainers began producing lower-quality footwear themselves, but selling it under the guild seal. This allowed them to compete with cobblers on price technically legal, but deeply controversial within the guild. Poorer masters, who could not afford to undercut or diversify, accused their richer counterparts of violating the spirit of the charter. Tensions mounted during guild meetings, and fines were issued not just to outsiders but within the guild ranks. The guild's unity, its greatest strength, was fracturing. Meanwhile, the number of apprentices decreased. Parents, once proud to place their sons in a prestigious trade, now questioned whether guild training guaranteed a future. Journeymen complained that they were stuck in a liminal space, unable to afford the fees required to open a master's shop, yet too skilled to remain as assistants. The cordwainers were becoming both too elite and too divided to adapt. A scandal of souls. In 1301, the cordwainers' authority suffered a major blow. A merchant was found to be selling shoes marked with the guild seal that had not passed inspection. These shoes, cracked at the sole and dyed with band pigments, had been produced in a small shop owned by a master who had secretly subcontracted work to a cobbler. The scandal, known in guild records as l'affaire des semelles crevées, the affair of the cracked soles, shook the guild to its core. The royal provost launched an inquiry. Testimonies revealed that the master had bypassed inspections by paying off an underpaid guild inspector. Worse, the cordwainers' own jurés had ignored warnings about the shop's irregular practices. Public confidence waned. The guild, once seen as a guarantor of quality, was now tainted by greed and hypocrisy. To repair its image, the guild expelled 2 members, rewrote parts of its charter, and increased inspection rigor. But the damage had been done. The moral authority of the cordwainers was no longer unquestioned. The cobblers organized. While the cordwainers restructured, the cobblers quietly organized. They had no official guild status, but they began holding regular meetings at a hostelry near the church of Saint Jacques de la Boucherie. There, they drafted their own internal codes of conduct, set informal price guidelines, discussed strategies to avoid seizure of goods, collected money to support members fined or arrested. This proto-guild did not call itself such; it would have violated royal statutes, but it functioned with discipline and intent. For cobblers, who had long worked in the shadows of the city's economic system, this was a form of solidarity that went beyond craft. It was about dignity. And soon, they would make a bold move. In 1306, the cobblers submitted a petition to the king, asking for formal recognition as a distinct guild. Their argument: "We serve the common people of the city in peace and with craft. Let us do so in daylight, under seal and not under threat." The king did not respond yet, but the cordwainers did. Preparing for battle. The prospect of cobblers gaining full guild status ignited panic among the cordwainers. They held emergency assemblies. Letters were sent to other guilds, warning of the danger of trade dilution. Several cordwainers threatened to withdraw from Paris entirely if their charter was weakened. In truth, they feared not just competition, but a shift in power. If cobblers once deemed subcraft could gain guild recognition, what would stop candle makers, tinkers, or even market women from doing the same? The charter dispute that began in 1268 had returned louder, messier, and now with more at stake. And so Paris waited. What would the king decide? Would tradition triumph over utility? Would the guilds remain the guardians of Parisian trade, or would necessity force the crown's hand? By the early years of the 14th century, Paris stood at the crossroads of tradition and transformation. Its guilds, once the unshakable backbone of the city's economic structure, were now locked in a battle not just with each other, but with the demands of a growing, increasingly stratified population. At the center of this storm remained the cordwainers, prestigious, embattled, and increasingly isolated. And opposite them, the cobblers, long dismissed as peripheral, now stood poised to challenge the very foundations of guild supremacy. What began as a dispute over who could make a shoe had evolved into a fundamental question: who controls craft? A king's quiet calculus. In 1307, after months of silence, the crown issued its decision. But it came not as a dramatic proclamation, nor as a fully formed charter. Instead, the King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, opted for incremental recognition. He issued an ordinance that allowed cobblers to form an officially recognized brotherhood, confrérie, though not a full guild, permitted them to create internal statutes, elect representatives, and collect dues, required them to submit to cordwainer inspection when producing shoes for sale, though the cordwainers could not impose arbitrary fines, explicitly forbade cobblers from advertising their wares as cordwainer quality or using imported cordovan leather. In short, the king split the difference. He gave cobblers visibility, structure, and partial legitimacy while preserving the cordwainer's symbolic superiority. But the symbolism was no longer enough. To many working-class Parisians, the cobblers had won. They were now part of the city's institutional landscape, not just tolerated but endorsed, however cautiously. Their prices remained lower, their access to poorer customers broader, and their ranks more socially diverse. And with the king's recognition came civic presence processions during feast days, contributions to parish events, and a growing sense of place in the city's economic ecology. The cordwainers' decline. The cordwainers retained their charter, their status, and their luxurious clientele. But in the years that followed, they lost something more valuable: control. Merchants increasingly sourced shoes from cobblers when speed and cost mattered more than prestige. Apprentices, discouraged by high fees and rigid structures, began avoiding cordwainer workshops altogether. Complaints of declining quality appeared in city records, with some customers alleging that guild-approved shoes wore out faster than cobbled ones. The guild responded with more regulations, stricter apprenticeships, more inspections, and even attempts to control raw leather prices. But the more it tightened its grip, the more it alienated would-be members and partners. Even some wealthier cordwainers quietly began outsourcing to cobblers, just as others had done in the scandal of 1301. It became clear that the cordwainers were no longer the sole arbiters of shoemaking in Paris. They were a legacy institution in an evolving city. The shoemaker's festival and civic identity. One unexpected consequence of the cobblers' recognition was the creation of a new civic celebration. In 1312, the cobblers' brotherhood organized a public feast and mass on the feast day of Saint Crispin, patron saint of shoemakers. Held in the place Saint-Honoré, the event featured a procession of cobblers carrying banners, donation of shoes to the city's poor, a small pageant depicting Saint Crispin's defiance of unjust rulers. The event, though modest, was a cultural statement. Cobblers were not just craftsmen, they were citizens, they were contributors, they were a community. The cordwainers, in response, added a special Thanksgiving Mass to their calendar, but their tone was defensive, their audience narrower. This battle over shoes had moved beyond economics. It was now about identity and civic belonging. Echoes across Europe. What happened in Paris would echo in cities across Europe. In Florence, disputes emerged between master cloth dyers and street-level colorists who offered cheaper services. In London, the cordwainers and cobblers fought similar battles, so much so that by 1395, the English crown had to issue multiple rulings to prevent guild monopolies from driving up prices. In Ghent and Bruges, as guilds expanded their privileges, parallel systems of informal workers formed associations that mirrored the very structure they were denied entry to. The 1268 dispute in Paris, then, was not an isolated conflict, but part of a larger medieval tension: the desire for guild control versus the reality of urban complexity. And in every city, the same question returned. If skill is the measure of craft, who has the right to define it? Final reflection: craft, control, and common good. The story of the cordwainers and cobblers is not merely about shoes. It is about the limits of protectionism, the resilience of informal labor, and the reality that institutions, no matter how sacred, must adapt or risk irrelevance. The cordwainers began as the gatekeepers of quality, and for a time, they elevated shoemaking into an art. But their refusal to accommodate change, to admit economic diversity, and to trust the broader community eventually undermined the very authority they hoped to preserve. The cobblers, for their part, built power quietly through community, service, and sheer necessity. They proved that craftsmanship lives not only in statutes, but in the work done when no one is watching. Today, shoes are mass-produced in factories across the world. But the old Parisian conflict lingers, visible in every debate about licensing, labor rights, market regulation, and the definition of skilled work. We still ask who gets to work, who gets to belong, and who gets to decide. Perhaps in the quiet streets of medieval Paris, paved by centuries of footsteps, those questions were first whispered not in royal halls, but over a pair of humble soles, shaped by hand, sold at market, and worn by the forgotten majority. Story 6. The Glovers of Perth and the Battle over Dye Rights. The town of Perth, nestled along the River Tay, may not have been the largest or most cosmopolitan city in medieval Scotland, but in the 14th century, it held a special place in the kingdom's economic and political life. With its stone bridge, fortified walls, and thriving trade routes, Perth was a strategic stronghold for both the Scottish crown and the growing merchant class. It was also home to a guild of craftsmen with a peculiar, prestigious specialty, the Glovers. In a world where handwear symbolized authority, protection, and civic status, the Glovers of Perth were among the most respected artisans in town. Their trade sat at the crossroads of fashion, function, and identity. But even gloved hands can come to blows, especially when access to color became the catalyst for one of the most contentious trade disputes in medieval Scotland. The rise of the glover's craft. Gloves in the 14th century were not mere accessories. They were signifiers of class and role. Nobles wore embroidered gloves as part of their regalia. Bishops raised gloved hands in blessing. Judges handed down sentences while donning stiff ceremonial gloves. For laborers and soldiers, gloves were armor defenses against cold, abrasion, and weaponry. Perth's glovers specialized in fine deerskin and goat hide gloves, which they softened, stitched, and sometimes perfumed with imported oils. They learned their trade through years of apprenticeship under strict guild supervision, forming a small but elite group in the town's economic hierarchy. But the defining feature of a glove, the detail that separated a lord's hand from a merchant's, was color. The dyer's monopoly. The right to dye cloth or leather in medieval towns was jealously guarded. In Perth, that right belonged exclusively to the dyer's guild, a separate but equally powerful body of craftsmen. Dyeing was not just a matter of aesthetics. The process involved expensive ingredients like woad, madder, indigo, and most coveted of all, kermes and cochineal, tiny insects whose crimson pigments created deep reds favored by royalty and high clergy. Because these substances were costly and sometimes imported through multiple middlemen, the dyers insisted that only their guild had the expertise to handle them without waste or fraud. The glovers, for a time, accepted this arrangement. They sent raw gloves to the dyers for coloring, then retrieved them for finishing and sale. But by the late 1330s, tensions began to rise. The root of the dispute. The conflict began, as so many trade disputes did, with a question of delay and inconsistency. The glovers claimed that the dyers were overcharging for small volume jobs, refusing to guarantee color consistency, especially on thin leathers, delaying delivery, causing customers, especially nobles with expectations, to grow impatient. More seriously, the glovers accused the dyers of dyeing their own gloves on the side and selling them directly, bypassing the glovers entirely. Whether true or not, the charge struck at the core of the guild system, infringement on a fellow trade's domain. In 1339, the Glovers' Guild submitted a formal complaint to the Burgh Council of Perth, asking for permission to dye their own leathers at least in small batches. The dyers responded with fury, accusing the Glovers of trying to monopolize multiple crafts. The council's decision, denied. But the Glovers were not deterred. Underground dyes. Denied official approval, several master glovers began conducting dye experiments in secret. Using natural plant dyes, onion skins, lichen, walnut husks, they created muted browns, yellows, and pale greens. These household hues were less vivid than guild dyes but more than acceptable for lower status customers. By 1341, dyed gloves were being sold in Perth's lesser markets without the dyer's guild mark. The dyers responded by inspecting shops, seizing products, and demanding fines. Soon, gloves began arriving in town from outside Perth from nearby villages, even from as far as Aberdeen, gloves that had been dyed with no oversight and sold at a fraction of the price. The dyers feared collapse. The Glovers saw an opening. And then, unexpectedly, the issue escalated to royal attention. A royal commission gloved in politics. In 1343, King David II of Scotland, eager to assert his influence over Burgh matters after returning from exile in France, announced a commission to review guild rights in several key towns, Perth included. The Glovers sent a representative, Andrew Mac Kinlay, a second-generation craftsman with a reputation for precision and temperance. He brought gloves in muted green, deep tan, and a blue so faint it was nearly gray. The dyers sent Gavin Brown, a fierce defender of his guild's legacy, who claimed that the Glovers' dyes would degrade, embarrass noble wearers, and tarnish the Burgh's reputation. Mac Kinlay countered with letters from local merchants and one minor baron who preferred the natural hues as more dignified. The commission, pressed for time and unwilling to alienate either guild, made a compromise. Glovers could dye leathers in colors not traditionally used by the dyers' guild. They could not use imported pigments or claim parity with official dyers. Any glove dyed in-house must bear a distinct maker's mark to distinguish it from guild-dyed goods. It was not full autonomy, but it was a wedge, and it changed everything. The Glovers had opened the door to independence, but at what cost to their standing and to the unity of Perth's crafts? Would guild control fracture entirely, or evolve into a new understanding of mutual limitation? The decision of 1343 had created a curious détente. Glovers, once entirely dependent on the dyers' guild, now held the right to dye leather but only in natural, muted tones, and only under a new condition. They must stamp every product with a distinctive maker's mark. At first glance, this appeared to be a compromise rooted in logic and fairness. But in practice, it created an entirely new layer of trade complexity in the city of Perth. The glove was no longer just a garment or accessory, it had become a legal object, carrying a coded message about who had made it, how, and with what authority. And not everyone was comfortable with what that message implied. The problem with marks. The Burgh Council, anticipating disputes, appointed a neutral notary to register all Glovers' marks. Each symbol, ranging from simple initials to ornate patterns, had to be unique and affixed to every glove sold within the city. This requirement, while seemingly administrative, quickly led to unexpected consequences. Some buyers began associating certain marks with lower quality, believing that natural dye gloves were inherently inferior. Others, especially the emerging middle class of merchants and clerks, began preferring marked gloves, interpreting them as more authentic or homemade. Dyers, meanwhile, began branding their own stamped gloves more aggressively, turning what had once been invisible craftwork into a competition of symbols. Merchants, both local and itinerant, found themselves explaining again and again what each mark meant, which gloves were gilt-dyed, and whether the color on a glove was true or merely rustic. Confusion bred suspicion, and suspicion in a tightly knit burgh like Perth rarely remained private for long. Whispers in the taverns. By 1345, rumors began circulating that some glovers were illegally acquiring dyestuffs from foreign merchants passing through Leith and Dundee. Kermes, madder, and even small amounts of indigo were allegedly finding their way into the hands of enterprising craftsmen willing to risk the council's wrath for a richer hue. The Dyers' Guild launched a quiet investigation. Using informants, often younger apprentices, they monitored suspicious activity. One such report accused a prominent glover, Henry Cadell, of possessing red-dyed gloves that were too vivid to have come from onion skin or nettle root. Cadell, summoned before the council, denied all wrongdoing. He claimed the red was the result of a multi-step dyeing process using alder bark and crushed cherries. Though never conclusively proven, the case inflamed tensions. Several dyers accused the council of favoring the glovers to curb the Dyers' Guild's growing political power. In response, the dyers began pushing for a new statute, that all gloves, regardless of origin, must bear two marks, one from the glover and one from a certified dyer. The glovers refused. They claimed the proposal would undermine their limited autonomy and make them subservient once more. The council divides. The burgh council, made up of a blend of merchants, minor nobility, and guild masters, found itself bitterly divided. Some councillors saw the glovers' innovation as a way to diversify Perth's economy, especially amid growing competition from towns like Stirling and Edinburgh. Others, many with familial ties to the Dyers' Guild, viewed any concession to the glovers as a threat to the integrity of traditional crafts. Public hearings were held. Guilds began forming alliances, with bakers and butchers siding with the glovers, perhaps envisioning future autonomy in their own domains, while smiths and weavers aligned with the dyers. In the midst of this tension, a neutral party emerged. The glove merchants, a class of traders who did not make gloves but sold them in volume. These merchants, increasingly involved in regional trade routes, urged a different solution: allow both glovers and dyers to produce dyed gloves, but establish a common hall of inspection, where gloves of all types would be assessed, sorted, and stamped by an independent inspector. The idea was controversial. Who would pay for the hall, who would appoint the inspector, and who would trust such a person? A new institution, the Glover's Table. Against the odds, compromise prevailed. In 1347, the Burgh Council approved the creation of the Glover's Table, a stone bench under the open canopy of Mercat Cross, where gloves were to be presented each Friday for public inspection. The Glover's mark would still be required. A new, neutral leather assay stamp, a symbol of quality, not origin, would be granted to gloves that met minimum standards of dye integrity and stitching. The Dyers' Guild was allowed to display its own stamp on gloves it had dyed, but could not deny access to merchants selling glovers' goods. The Glover's Table soon became more than a checkpoint. It turned into a symbol of regulated independence, proof that a trade could evolve without dissolving into anarchy. Yet not all were satisfied. Some master dyers, resentful of their diminished exclusivity, began slowly withdrawing from Perth, moving to towns where their monopoly remained unchallenged. A few glovers, emboldened by their limited victory, pushed the limits of permissible color, creating deeper purples and forest greens that skated dangerously close to the edge of legality. A town's image in a pair of gloves. By 1350, Perth's reputation as a center of natural-dyed craftsmanship had begun to spread beyond Scotland. Merchants from York, Dublin, and even Flanders sought out Perth gloves for their subtle palette and rustic elegance. This new aesthetic, neither courtly nor peasant, reflected a larger cultural moment, a rising appetite for goods that bore visible markers of locality, craft, and traceable origin. Ironically, it was the very restrictions imposed on the glovers that had created the demand. Their muted tones, imposed by legal compromise, now stood out in a market flooded with loud colors and factory-stamped products. And in Perth, where once dye was a battleground, it had become a shared language of negotiation, creativity, and civic adaptation. Yet beneath this cautious peace lingered a question still whispered in taverns and at merchant tables alike. If color could be shared, what about cutting, stitching, or even trade itself? How long could the guild system contain innovation before it was redefined entirely? By the early 1350s, the glover's table in Mercat Cross had become a fixture in the rhythm of weekly trade. What had begun as a compromise, a site for inspection and stampings, grew into an informal public stage, where tradespeople, customers, and counselors gathered to view the week's new offerings. Some gloves bore 2 marks, others just 1. Some showed signs of careful hand dyeing in subtle yellows and grays, while others shimmered faintly in deeper tones. What mattered, increasingly, was not who had dyed the glove, but how well it had been made. This shift in focus from process to product signaled something larger, the slow erosion of guild absolutism. And with that erosion came new opportunities and new risks. The legacy of limitations. The dyers' guild never fully regained its former dominance. Though it remained a powerful force in the city's economy, it now coexisted uneasily with a reality in which other craftsmen could color materials, albeit in constrained ways. The Glovers' Guild, emboldened by its partial victory, began pushing boundaries in other areas. Seeking permission to train apprentices outside the city, something previously reserved for master tailors and smiths. Proposing shared leather-buying cooperatives that included cobblers, saddlers, and even tanners. Offering reduced-fee membership to journeyman glovers who had trained abroad. These actions did not go unchallenged. Conservative guild leaders accused the glovers of weakening the standards of craft, diluting the hard-earned privileges of urban artisans. But others saw the glovers' choices not as rebellion, but as adaptation, a way to survive in a changing economy, where towns grew faster than charters could be amended. By the 1360s, similar changes could be seen in other Scottish burghs. In Dundee, the weavers and dyers established joint halls, ending decades of dispute. In Stirling, cordwainers began subcontracting to independent apprentices, bypassing traditional restrictions on workshop size. In Aberdeen, the Glovers' Guild itself began accepting non-burghers as honorary members, a move unthinkable a generation earlier. The Black Death and the disruption of order. Then came the plague. Scotland was not spared from the ravages of the Black Death, which reached Perth around 1349 and returned in waves through the 1350s. Guild registers from this period show gaps, crossed-out names, and hastily added notations. Date of pest, nay kin to claim tools, dyers hall empty 04. The labor force collapsed, skilled hands became scarce, and for a time all rules softened. Former apprentices took over workshops without formal promotion. New dyeing methods, some borrowed from itinerant workers or foreign merchants, spread quickly. Guild inspections became sporadic, replaced by practical agreements among survivors. In this moment of crisis, the differences between glovers and dyers blurred. What mattered was not protection of privilege, but the maintenance of production, of basic goods that still had to be made and traded. And when the plague ebbed, the survivors found themselves in a new world, one where necessity had rewritten precedent. Gloves as memory and meaning. By 1370, a new generation of glovers led the Perth Guild. Many bore no memory of the original dispute. To them, The dual-marked glove was not a symbol of struggle, it was simply how gloves were made. Some gloves were still dyed by guild-approved dyers, now mostly older men with apprentices of varied backgrounds. Others were made in smaller family-run workshops in side lanes and rural outposts, where dye came from bark, berries, or merchant scraps. Curiously, the glover's table persisted not out of legal requirement but tradition. Craftsmen continued to display their work there, often out of pride rather than necessity. And the marks? They remained, not because they were required, but because buyers valued traceability. They wanted to know who made their goods, not to judge, but to connect. The once feared mark had become a signature, a form of storytelling, a quiet reminder of hands long gone. Echoes in time. What began as a narrow dispute over dyeing rights had, over decades, reshaped the very definition of craft, cooperation, and authority in a Scottish burgh. The Glovers of Perth had not destroyed the Dyers' Guild, nor had they abandoned the notion of regulation. Instead, they had negotiated a third path, one that accepted boundaries while slowly stretching them through diplomacy, persistence, and quiet defiance. Their legacy lives not in statues or chronicles, but in the long-forgotten routines of daily artisanship, the simple act of making something, marking it with a name, and offering it to a waiting world. In our modern world, where intellectual property battles, brand wars, and craft identity still dominate industry, the story of the Glovers reminds us. Innovation often begins not with the powerful, but with the constrained, the practical, and the persistent. And in every handmade object, perhaps there still lingers the quiet echo of a Perth glove stamped, stitched, and dyed in defiance of a rule no longer relevant.